It was the end of October in 2013 when I decided to take a few days off work and head to a small cabin in the woods. After months of nonstop work, dealing with people, clients, and meetings, I felt I needed a break from everything. No phones, no internet, just me and the quiet of the wilderness. I was 29 at the time, and my only company on this trip was my dog, a mixed breed shepherd named Max. The cabin was an old, rustic place, tucked away on the edge of the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. I'd found it on a rental website after browsing through options that promised peace and solitude. The description said it was a small, one-bedroom cabin built by a local family years ago. It mentioned nothing about luxury amenities, just basic, no-frills living. That's exactly what I wanted, something simple. I drove up alone, Max sitting quietly in the back seat of my old truck, occasionally turning his head to look at me as I hummed along to the radio. The sun was setting by the time I turned onto the narrow, winding road that led to the cabin. The trees were starting to lose their leaves, and the ground was covered with a blanket of autumn-colored foliage. It was beautiful, exactly what I had imagined. The cabin was about a mile off the main road, hidden from any nearby homes. It was isolated, which was perfect for what I was looking for. No neighbors, no distractions, just the natural world surrounding me. I pulled up the gravel driveway, past the small wooden gate, and parked my truck in front of the porch. Max jumped out of the truck, stretching his legs and sniffing the air. The cabin itself looked like something straight out of a postcard. The wood was weathered but sturdy, with a small porch and a couple of rocking chairs. There was a fire pit in the yard, surrounded by logs that acted as benches. It wasn't huge, but it was perfect for one person, and Max seemed to take to it immediately. I grabbed the keys from the small box next to the door and unlocked it. The air inside was musty but had a comforting, old-timey feel to it. There was a fireplace on one wall, and the furniture, though basic, was well maintained. A small kitchen sat next to the living room, and the wooden floor creaked underfoot as I stepped further inside. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the quietness settle in around me. Max was already exploring the place, sniffing the corners and investigating the small rooms. I unpacked my bags and put a few logs in the fireplace. The fire lit easily, crackling as it began to warm the room. I set up my small camp stove in the kitchen to cook some dinner. I didn't plan to do much on this trip, just read a bit, relax, and take some time for myself. That evening, the quiet of the woods outside was almost deafening. There was no wind, no sounds of animals, just the occasional rustling of leaves. The fire in the fireplace cast shadows that danced across the walls, and Max lay curled up on a rug, content. It wasn't until later that night, after I had finished dinner and was sitting on the couch with a book, that I first heard something strange. It was a soft noise, like a tapping, almost rhythmic, coming from outside. I paused, listening. Max raised his head, his ears twitching. I stood up, setting my book down and walking toward the window. The cabin had large windows that faced the trees, and the porch light was on, casting a pale glow over the yard. At first, I couldn't see anything unusual. The trees swayed slightly in the breeze, and the yard was empty. But the tapping continued. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere near the back of the cabin, closer to the woods. My heart started to beat a little faster. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a woodpecker or something hitting a tree. But the sound wasn't quite right. It had a more deliberate rhythm, like someone was knocking on the side of the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight from the table by the door and stepped outside, Max following closely behind. The air had grown colder, and the wind had picked up a little. The tapping had stopped by the time I made it to the back of the cabin, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I shone the flashlight around, scanning the trees and the underbrush, but there was nothing there. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence stretch around me. Then, Max suddenly barked, his tail stiff and ears perked. He was staring into the darkness beyond the edge of the yard, the flashlight beam catching his eyes as they glinted in the light. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't know why, but something told me to go back inside. I called Max to me, and he trotted over to my side. I didn't look back as I stepped inside, locking the door behind me. I settled back onto the couch, trying to shake off the unease that had crept into me. It wasn't just the tapping that bothered me. It was the way the woods felt, alive somehow. I kept the fire going, and soon, the warmth of the flames helped ease the tension in my body. The next day, I spent most of the morning walking along the trails around the cabin. I didn't want to dwell too much on what had happened the night before, but something in my gut told me that I should be more cautious. Max stayed close to me as he usually did, occasionally stopping to sniff around. There were no signs of anything unusual, no tracks, no broken branches, just the normal noises of the forest. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun had begun to set again. The sky was clear, and the air was cold but refreshing. I decided to start a fire again and make myself a warm meal. The tapping from last night had completely slipped my mind until I heard it again. This time, it was unmistakable. It wasn't just a faint tapping. It was more pronounced. It came from the side of the cabin, right near the window I had been standing at earlier. Max immediately went on alert, his body stiffening as he stood in front of me. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed the flashlight again and stepped outside. The sound stopped the moment I stepped onto the porch. I scanned the yard, the trees, the edge of the woods. There was nothing there. The silence seemed too deep, too still. I was beginning to get frustrated. My mind was working overtime, thinking of all the possible explanations. Maybe it was a raccoon. Maybe there was a squirrel knocking against the wall. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The next few hours passed in a tense quiet. I tried to distract myself by reading, but the noise kept lingering in my mind. Max lay beside me, but I could tell he was uneasy. I decided to lock all the doors and windows just to be safe. I tried to relax, but every little creak of the floorboards made me jump. It wasn't until the middle of the night that things took a darker turn. I woke up suddenly, jolted awake by a sharp noise. It was the same tapping sound, but this time it was much louder. It was coming from directly outside the front door, like someone was knocking. I froze. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Max was wide awake, his eyes glowing in the dim light of the cabin. He stood at attention, his low growl vibrating in his chest. I slowly got out of bed, grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand. I crept to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I opened the door a crack, shining the flashlight into the yard. There was no one there. The wind was still, and the only sound was the distant rustling of leaves. I stepped outside, the cold air biting into my skin. Max followed me closely, and I scanned the area, shining the light around. My eyes kept darting between the trees, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. The yard was empty, but then I heard it again. This time it was coming from the woods. I felt my stomach drop. I didn't know why, but I knew that whatever it wasn't natural. It wasn't just a person. It wasn't just an animal. There was something about the rhythm of the sound, the way it echoed in the quiet, that felt wrong. It was deliberate, methodical. I glanced at Max. He was looking into the darkness, his ears standing straight up. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I didn't know how much longer I could stand there, but something told me I had to find out what was causing that sound. I grabbed a stick from the ground just in case. Max was already moving toward the woods, his instincts pulling him forward. I followed him, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping grew louder as we walked deeper into the forest. And then I saw it, a figure, standing between the trees. It wasn't a person, not really. It was too tall, too thin, its body almost blending in with the shadows. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it staring at me, watching me. It didn't move. It just stood there, still as stone. I took a step back, my heart racing. Max started to growl, low and menacing. I had no idea what I was looking at, but I knew I needed to get back to the cabin. Fast. We turned and ran. The figure didn't chase us. It didn't move at all, but I could feel its presence, even as I made it back to the cabin. I slammed the door behind me, locking it as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking, and Max was still on edge, pacing back and forth, his eyes darting toward the woods. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't know who or what was out there, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't going away. It's strange how a place can seem so peaceful, almost inviting, yet have an undercurrent of unease running through it like an unspoken truth. It was a Sunday afternoon when I drove up to that cabin, a place I'd never been before, but had heard about from friends and relatives. Tucked away deep in the woods, about 3 hours outside of town, I'd taken the trip on a whim. I had been feeling restless lately, constantly on edge, looking for an escape. When the invitation came, I figured it would be the perfect opportunity to clear my head. The cabin was old, weathered, and worn down by years of neglect. It was almost as if nature itself was slowly reclaiming it, with vines creeping up its wooden walls and moss growing thick on the roof. The shingles were curled at the edges, and the front porch sagged under the weight of time. Still, there was something oddly charming about it. I had always been a fan of old things, rustic, historical, and this place, it seemed, had a story to tell. I parked my truck on the gravel path and grabbed my bags. The air smelled fresh, with the scent of pine trees filling my lungs. A soft breeze rustled the leaves, and I could hear the distant sound of birds calling to each other. The weather was nice, a clear sky with a hint of the approaching evening chill. It seemed like the kind of place where nothing could go wrong. As I walked toward the cabin, I noticed the silence. There were no other sounds aside from the birds and the wind. I had expected to hear something, a creek running nearby, maybe the sound of wildlife, even the occasional rustle in the underbrush. But nothing, just an empty, still quiet that hung over the place like a heavy blanket. The door creaked when I pushed it open, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. The interior was just as worn as the outside, but it had a certain rustic charm. Old furniture, dusty with age, stood against the walls. There was a small stone fireplace on one end of the room and a large window opposite it that looked out into the woods. A few wooden chairs were scattered around, with a table in the center of the room that seemed to have been used for everything from meals to work. A thick layer of dust covered everything, the kind of dust that accumulates over years of neglect. I set my bags down near the door and took a deep breath. The place was lonely, almost forgotten, but it felt like a safe haven for someone who needed a break from the noise of the world. I started to unpack, taking my time, enjoying the simple task of settling in. But as I moved about the cabin, I started to notice the oddities, things that seemed out of place. There was a small, half-burned candle on the table, surrounded by blackened wax. It looked like someone had tried to light it recently but hadn't succeeded. The bed in the corner had its sheets pulled back, as though someone had been sleeping there but had left in a hurry. And the smell. The cabin had a faint smell of dampness and mildew, but underneath it, there was something else, something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was strange. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the old nature of the place. After all, it had been abandoned for years. Still, There was a subtle unease gnawing at the back of my mind. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. As the evening crept in, I decided to explore a bit. There was a trail behind the cabin, winding into the trees, and I was curious about where it might lead. I grabbed my jacket and a flashlight and set off, hoping to clear my head with a walk. The trail was narrow, the ground soft beneath my boots. The trees towered over me, casting long shadows as the light from the setting sun filtered through the branches. The further I walked, the thicker the woods became. The trail grew harder to follow, with roots sticking out of the ground and branches that reached out like fingers. I had to step carefully, watching my footing, but I didn't mind. There was something peaceful about the isolation, something that let me forget the worries that had been weighing me down. That was until I noticed the house. At first, it looked like a trick of the light. Through the trees, I saw what I thought was another cabin, smaller and more weathered than the one I was staying in. The roof was nearly collapsed, and the windows were broken, their jagged edges gleaming in the dim light. I froze, my heart suddenly racing in my chest. What was a cabin doing out here, hidden in the woods? I didn't remember seeing any mention of it when I was given directions to the first cabin. I took a few cautious steps toward it, curiosity getting the better of me. The closer I got, the more I realized how abandoned it truly was. The door was hanging off its hinges, and there was a pile of broken furniture scattered around the yard. The place looked like it had been forgotten, left to rot away. Yet, there was something strange about it, something that sent a shiver down my spine. I turned to leave, my instincts telling me to get out of there. But just as I did, I caught something in the corner of my eye. A figure, standing at one of the broken windows, staring out at me. I froze, my heart hammered in my chest. There was no way anyone could be in there. The cabin was in worse shape than the one I was staying in. It had been abandoned for years. Yet, I couldn't deny what I had seen. A figure, tall and thin, standing motionless in the window watching me. I turned and sprinted back down the trail, not caring about the branches scratching my arms or the uneven ground beneath me. I just needed to get back to the safety of the main cabin. The feeling of being watched never left, though. It lingered with every step I took, as if the eyes of that figure were still on me, even though I couldn't see it anymore. When I reached the cabin, I slammed the door behind me and locked it. My breath came in quick bursts as I leaned against the door, trying to steady myself. I didn't know what to make of what I had seen. My mind kept running in circles, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Maybe my eyes had played a trick on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was wrong with that place, and I had gotten too close. I spent the rest of the evening inside, refusing to go back outside. I tried to calm my nerves, telling myself that I was overreacting. But as night fell, the noises of the woods outside began to intensify. The wind howled through the trees, and the sound of leaves rustling filled the air. But then, amidst the usual sounds of nature, I heard something else. A scratching noise, soft but deliberate. It was coming from the window. I held my breath, trying to listen. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent. Couldn't ignore it. Someone or something was out there. I glanced toward the window, but the darkness beyond made it impossible to see what was causing the noise. I crept toward the window, trying not to make a sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching continued, each scrape of whatever it was sending chills down my spine. I don't know how long I stood there, staring out into the night, waiting for the sound to stop. But it didn't. It seemed to grow louder and more frantic, as if whatever was out there was trying to get in. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob to make sure the door wouldn't open. Then, I moved to the other side of the cabin and sat in silence, holding my breath, hoping that whatever was out there would go away. The night passed slowly, every noise in the woods feeling like it was getting closer. Every minute felt like an eternity. I kept my eyes on the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. But when the sun finally rose, I found myself still alive, still safe inside the cabin. I felt a rush of relief, but it was tempered by the fear that lingered in the back of my mind. I left that morning, quickly gathering my things and getting into my truck. I didn't look back at the cabin as I drove away, but I could still hear that scratching noise in my mind, echoing in the silence of the woods. I didn't know what I had seen that night or what had been out there, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't ever coming back, and as I left the woods behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, something that had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. It had been one of those days where everything felt like it was going wrong. The weather had been unpredictable, and now, as the sun began to set, the clouds rolled in, threatening to drown the land in a heavy downpour. I had driven out to this remote cabin in the middle of nowhere, hoping for a few days of solitude and peace, but the eerie feeling that had settled over me since my arrival had only intensified. The cabin was small, made of dark, weathered wood that seemed like it had been there for decades. It had an old-world charm about it, but there was something unsettling about the place. The windows, though cracked and fogged, gave me glimpses of the woods surrounding the cabin, trees that loomed like giants, their branches twisting and creaking in the wind. I hadn't seen another soul for miles, which only added to the sense of isolation. I had come out here alone, needing to escape the constant noise of the city, needing time to think. My life had been full of chaos lately, work stress, personal issues, things that felt too heavy to carry anymore. The idea of spending a few nights here, away from everything, seemed like the perfect solution. But as the hours passed, I started to feel like I had made a mistake. The first night wasn't so bad. The rain started falling steadily around dusk, a soft patter against the roof. I made a fire in the small stove, cooked myself a simple meal, and settled into the old armchair near the window with a book. The flickering light of the fire and the rhythmic sound of the rain were soothing. But as the night wore on, something began to feel off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone. At first, I dismissed it. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, I thought. I was tired. I had been driving for hours. But then I heard it. A subtle sound, faint but distinct, the crunch of leaves. Outside, I froze, the book still in my hands. My heart rate spiked. Could have been an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, something wandering through the woods. The sound stopped, and for a moment, I thought it was nothing. But then there was more. Tap, a soft thud against the wooden walls. I stood up slowly, every muscle in my body tense. As I approached the door, my hand hesitated on the handle. Should I open it? Was it safe? I pulled the door open just a crack, peering out into the darkness. The rain had intensified, and the forest was nearly swallowed by it. The wind howled through the trees, their branches swaying, almost as if they were reaching for me. But there was no sign of anyone, no movement, no shapes in the shadows. I closed the door again, trying to calm myself. It was just my imagination, I told myself. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin seemed amplified. Every gust of wind outside felt like a whisper, a warning. I lay there, wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain and wondering if I had made a grave mistake coming here. The next morning came too quickly, gray and overcast. The air was thick, heavy with moisture. I forced myself out of bed and decided to take a walk to clear my head. The rain had let up, but the forest was still damp, the earth soft beneath my boots as I trudged along the muddy trail. The trees here were dense, Old-growth pines that towered over me, their branches stretching high into the sky. The scent of wet earth and pine needles filled my nostrils. The peacefulness of the forest was overwhelming, so much that it felt almost unnatural. The world seemed too quiet. Even the birds, usually so active at dawn, had fallen silent. As I walked deeper into the woods, the feeling of unease grew again. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. The thought was ridiculous, but it persisted, clinging to the edges of my mind. I came across a clearing after a while, a small open space surrounded by trees. In the center of the clearing was a strange structure. It wasn't a cabin, but it looked like some sort of old stone foundation, a remnant of something long abandoned. The stones were crumbling, covered in moss, and there was a strange, almost sickly aura about the place. I didn't want to go any closer, but something about it drew me in. Against my better judgment, I stepped toward the foundation, my feet squelching in the soft, wet earth. I reached out to touch one of the stones, my fingers brushing against the cold, damp surface. That's when I heard it, a rustle in the trees behind me. I spun around, but saw nothing. The clearing was empty, just as it had been a moment ago. Yet, my heart raced, and my breath came in shallow bursts. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I left the clearing quickly, almost running back to the safety of the cabin. The air felt different now, colder, sharper. It was as if the very woods had shifted, turned against me. I couldn't stop thinking about the strange foundation, the odd sensation I had felt when I was near it. That night, the rain returned, heavier this time, pounding relentlessly against the cabin. I tried to distract myself with a book again, but the words blurred on the page as my mind kept drifting. Every noise outside made my skin crawl. The wind, the rain, the creaking of the cabin. It all seemed to be conspiring against me. I finally gave up and decided to go to bed, pulling the blankets tightly around me. But sleep eluded me once more. The sense of being watched never left. I heard the tapping again, faint and rhythmic, like the sound of fingers drumming on the walls. The noise stopped. Then I heard a whisper. I wasn't imagining it. It was soft, almost inaudible, but it was there. Came from outside, from just beyond the window. My body froze, heart hammering in my chest. Couldn't move, couldn't speak. The whisper was followed by a scraping sound, as if something was dragging against the wooden exterior of the cabin. I waited, holding my breath. The sound stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was outside, waiting. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table, my hand trembling as I flicked it on. I crept toward the window, my breath fogging up the glass as I peered out into the storm. There was nothing, just the swirling darkness of the rain and the trees bending in the wind. I stepped back from the window, trying to steady myself. I was overreacting, I told myself. It was nothing. I had been cooped up in this cabin too long, and the isolation was messing with my head. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next day, I woke up late, groggy from lack of sleep. The weather had cleared slightly, though it was still cloudy and cold. I felt an overwhelming need to leave, to get out of that cabin and back to civilization, but I forced myself to stay for just one more day. I needed to shake this feeling, to prove to myself that I was overreacting. I decided to go for another walk, this time heading in the opposite direction from the clearing. I walked for hours, lost in the forest, trying to clear my mind. The woods were eerily quiet, the air thick with moisture. It felt like the world had become muffled, as if all sound had been swallowed up by the trees. By midday, I stumbled upon something strange, a narrow trail I had never seen before. The path was overgrown, barely visible, but it was clear that someone or something had been through here recently. The trees on either side of the trail were bent in odd directions, as though they had been disturbed. I hesitated, but then something in me pushed forward. Curiosity, a desire to understand what was going on. I followed the trail. After what felt like an eternity, I came upon a small, abandoned cabin. It wasn't the same as the one I was staying in. This one was in worse shape, its roof caving in, its windows shattered. Yet there was something oddly familiar about it. As I stood there, staring at the ruins, I realized where I had seen it before. It was the same cabin from my dreams. The realization hit me like a slap in the face. This was no coincidence. I had been drawn here. Somehow, I had been pulled into this place by forces I didn't understand. But there was no turning back now. I stepped inside the cabin, feeling a chill settle in the pit of my stomach. The air was musty, stale, and smelled of decay. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I moved deeper into the structure. My eyes scanned the room, taking in the dilapidated furniture, the broken windows, and the remnants of a life long gone. And then I saw it, a single photograph pinned to the wall. It was an old picture, faded and yellowed with time. A man stood in front of the cabin, his face obscured by shadows. But I recognized the shape of his features. It was me. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the photo. My mind was reeling, my body frozen in place. It wasn't possible. I had never been here before. I had never seen this cabin. And yet, there I was. I had to leave. I had to get out of this nightmare. I turned and ran, bursting out of the cabin and back onto the trail. I didn't stop until I reached my own cabin, breathing heavily, my heart racing. The woods seemed different now, darker, more oppressive. I didn't feel safe anymore. I packed my things quickly, my hands shaking as I shoved clothes into my bag. I didn't care about the rain or the mess. I just needed to get out of there, back to where I knew I was safe. As I drove away, the clouds finally broke, and the sun began to set, casting an eerie glow over the road ahead. But I didn't look back. Couldn't. The truth was clear now. Whatever had been drawing me to that cabin in the woods wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was something real, something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. But at least for now, I was free. My name is Dale Crawford. I was 48 years old when I took a seasonal job with the National Park Service in the spring of 2019. I had just left a construction job in southern Missouri, burned out and stiff in the joints from nearly 25 years of climbing roofs and lifting lumber. I didn't have much planned. I didn't have a wife or kids, just an aging dog named Trapper, and a sense that I'd wasted too many years waiting for a change that wasn't going to come unless I made it. That spring, I drove my old truck up to Montana and applied for a backcountry watch post job near the Canadian border. It wasn't the most glamorous position. They didn't have a formal station set up there, just a crude ranger cabin that hadn't been used regularly in over a decade. It was a 6-hour hike in from the main service road, and the only way to get there with gear was on horseback or by snowmobile when conditions allowed. I guess most people didn't want the isolation, but I didn't mind. I needed quiet. I needed to get away from people and all the small talk and fake smiles. They gave me the job right away. The cabin was a single-room structure with thick log walls and a rusted tin roof. The small wood stove in the corner had a cracked pipe that I patched with wire and foil. The front window was boarded up with mismatched planks, and the back window was so warped it barely opened. The floor creaked when I stepped anywhere near the bunk, but the place kept the rain off and the wind out. That was good enough. The job was simple. I had to monitor a stretch of remote forest, over 50 square miles of it, reporting anything out of place. Fires, illegal hunters, injured hikers. There was no cell service, no power, no radio towers in sight. I had a battery-powered field radio to call in reports once every 2 days. The batteries were expected to last all season, and I had a backup solar charger if needed. They gave me a paper map and an old GPS unit that looked like something from the 90s and told me to hike different parts of the park every day. It wasn't a problem. I had all the time in the world. I settled into a quiet routine. I would wake up early, boil coffee on the stove, feed Trapper, then set out for one of the trails. Some days I'd hike along the ridgeline, scanning for smoke or signs of illegal camps. Other days I'd make my way down the gulches, checking streams and animal tracks. Most of the time I didn't see anyone. Sometimes I'd find signs of old camps. Empty fire pits, broken beer bottles, animal bones stripped and tossed aside, but nothing too strange. I'd note the coordinates and report them during my check-ins. The isolation didn't bother me at first. In fact, it felt like a relief. The days were long and quiet, and the evenings were cold and calm. At night, I'd sit on the small porch, wrapped in a blanket, sipping from a bottle of rye and watching the stars come out one by one. Trapper would curl up beside me, listening to the forest sounds. It was peaceful. For a while, I felt more human than I had in years. But things changed in the third week of May. It started with a sound, something strange one night outside the cabin. It was nearly midnight. I had just turned off my lantern and was lying in the bunk with Trapper at my feet. The wind had picked up, making the walls creak, and I was drifting in that thin space between sleep and wakefulness when I heard a sharp knocking noise on the wall beside the stove. 3 knocks, then silence. I sat up, thinking maybe a branch had fallen or an animal had bumped the wall. But Trapper was alert. He was sitting up, ears stiff, staring toward the wall. Then came the knocks again. 3, slow, deliberate, not fast enough for an animal, not random enough for a falling branch. I grabbed the flashlight and the old hunting rifle I kept near the door and stepped outside. The moon was bright, and I could see across the clearing. The trees loomed like black teeth in every direction, but nothing moved. I circled the cabin, checking the ground. No tracks, no signs of anything out of place. Trapper sniffed around, tense but quiet. After 15 minutes, I went back in. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I found something about a half-mile from the cabin. It was a shirt, torn, faded, and wedged between 2 rocks near the creek. It didn't look old, maybe a few weeks in the sun and rain. It was a men's flannel shirt, sized large, with a torn sleeve and a patch of dried blood on the collar. No tags, no backpack nearby, no sign of whoever had left it. I logged it and kept going. 2 days later, I found a dead deer strung up in a pine tree about 4 miles north. The carcass had been gutted and left hanging by its hind legs, skinned clean. But the odd thing was the height, over 10 feet off the ground. No claw marks, no drag lines, just a single set of boot prints in the dirt nearby. I took photos and coordinates, and when I made my next report on the radio, I mentioned it. The reply was garbled, static, and a clipped confirmation. No follow-up came. That night, the knocking came again. But this time it was different. It moved. It started on the wall by the stove, then came again on the opposite wall. Then the front door. Always 3 knocks. Trapper growled the entire time, pressed low to the floor. I stayed awake until dawn, rifle across my chest, heart thudding like a drum. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe it was someone playing a joke, some backcountry idiot with too much time. But then more signs started to show up. A small pile of rocks arranged outside the cabin steps. A piece of leather cord nailed to a tree at eye level. A carved shape in the bark of a fir tree, like a spiral or a maze. I hadn't seen those things before, and I didn't put them there. I began to feel watched. Not always, just at certain moments on the trail when I'd stop to drink or tie my boot, and I'd feel that tension, that stillness that only comes when something else is near. Trapper would pick up on it too. His ears would flick. His body would stiffen. but we'd never see anyone.
No voices.
No movement, just that weight in the air like a held breath. One afternoon in early June, I returned to the cabin to find the door ajar. It hadn't been forced, no damage, no broken latch. I was sure I had locked it. Inside, nothing was stolen or destroyed, but the rifle had been moved. It was lying on the bunk instead of hanging on the wall, and one of the floorboards near the stove was loose. I didn't remember it being like that. I pried it up. Beneath was a small space with an old metal tin box inside. The box was rusted shut, but I broke it open with a hatchet. Inside were three things: a Polaroid photo of the cabin from the outside, a small spiral-bound notebook with half the pages torn out, and a worn compass. The photo was old, sun-faded. In the background was a man standing near the treeline, just barely visible. But what got me was his face. It had been scratched out with something sharp. The notebook only had a few entries. They were from someone named Mike or Mark. I couldn't tell. The handwriting was rushed. He had written about strange noises at night, tools going missing, and finding signs of someone living nearby. One entry caught me off guard. It said, "If you're reading this, don't trust the radio. It doesn't go where you think it does. They're not coming. Leave while you can." That night, I stayed up again. I didn't sleep. I built a small fire in the stove and sat with my back to the door, rifle in hand. At around 2 a.m., I saw movement outside. A tall figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching. No light, no sound, just stillness. I stood slowly and raised the rifle, but the figure moved, quick and smooth, back into the trees. Trapper growled low and steady. I didn't go after it. I stayed inside until morning. I started hiking different paths, trying to find any signs of camps or activity. I widened my range, but each time I left, I came back to new signs. A cut in the leather of my pack. A piece of rope tied to the cabin post. Once, I found a rabbit's foot nailed to the window frame. My reports were going unanswered now. The radio would crackle, then die. I couldn't tell if anyone was hearing me. The solar charger had stopped working. I felt cut off. The last straw came in late June. I had hiked out toward the ridge to check on a stream. It was a long hike, nearly 7 hours round trip. When I returned to the cabin, the front door was wide open. Trapper froze on the steps. Inside, the walls were covered in markings, scratches, carvings, symbols. The mattress was gone. The photo from the tin box had been pinned to the wall, and written beneath it in ash or charcoal were the words, "You stayed too long." That night, I packed everything I could. I loaded up food, gear, maps, and the rifle. I didn't sleep. The first light, I left the cabin and didn't look back. I hiked east, avoiding the main trails, and didn't stop until I reached the ranger station road 2 days later. I was ragged, half-starved, and sunburned, but I didn't care. I filed a report. The park officials listened politely, took my photos, took my notes. Then they thanked me and said they'd look into it. I never heard anything again. I didn't return the next season. I didn't go back for the paycheck or the gear I left behind. I moved down to New Mexico, took a job driving trucks for a local construction yard. I don't hike much anymore. I don't go near the woods. And sometimes late at night, when the wind's up and the house creaks, I still hear those 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate, always 3. But I don't get up. I don't check. I just wait until it stops. And it always does. Eventually. I hadn't been back to Benton Hollow in nearly 8 years. I'd avoided that winding road with its narrow shoulders and thick tree lines like it was cursed. Maybe not cursed in a fantasy way, just unlucky. Too many memories in the moss-draped woods, in the mud-packed ditches, in the sharp curve that hides the turn-off to the cabin. my ex-husband's cabin. When I left Caleb in 2017, I meant it. There wasn't any dramatic screaming or cheating or scandal. We just dried up. I couldn't keep pretending it was something it wasn't. The silence became heavier than the fighting ever was, and I felt like I was suffocating in a house where no one spoke. When I left, he stayed out there in that cabin we used to share, tucked about 10 miles off Highway 59, just outside a little town in Arkansas called Morrow Creek. I moved to Kansas City and started again. But life has a way of dragging you backward. In March 2025, I had to drive to Elkins, Arkansas, to help my sister with some family paperwork after she and her husband finalized their divorce. The route was tight. Every GPS and app steered me south past Morrow Creek. That meant driving the old road again. I could have taken the long way around, added an extra hour, but I told myself it was just a road. The trees were taller than I remembered. Or maybe I was shorter somehow, less sure of myself. They leaned in from both sides like they wanted to block out the sky. The shoulders were still soft from recent rain. The whole place smelled like moss, wet clay, and pine bark. It was early evening when I hit that familiar bend, and I felt my fingers tighten on the steering wheel before I even realized where I was. There was the turnoff, barely noticeable, a patch of gravel between two drooping pine trees, the kind of place only locals or people who lived out there would recognize. I don't know what made me stop. Curiosity, maybe, or guilt, or something I couldn't quite name. I pulled over and stared down the path. The gravel had thinned to packed dirt, and moss grew up the trunks like veins on old skin. I told myself I was just going to look, just a glance, maybe drive in 100 yards and turn around. But the truck kept rolling. That road, I knew every dip and bump by heart. Caleb and I laid that gravel ourselves in 2014, dragging wheelbarrows full of stone from the front and laying them flat by hand. Now it looked like no one had touched it in years. Ruts ran deep from old tires. Rain had etched channels along the sides, and everything smelled like wet decay. Leaves stuck to the windshield wipers, and branches scraped the side panels. I felt like I was driving into a mouth that didn't want to spit me back out. It was almost dark when the cabin came into view. The porch roof had started to sag, and the gutters hung loose in some places. The place wasn't falling down, but it looked tired, like it was holding its breath. My truck idled at the edge of the clearing. I wasn't going to get out. That was my plan. Just take a look and go. But the longer I stared, the more I started wondering what Caleb had done with himself. If he was even still out here. If he was okay. I hadn't heard from him in years, not directly anyway. A few friends in town had said he went quiet. No phone, no social media, just the same old co-op job and the same old routine. But the porch light was on, and that threw me, because I knew Caleb. He never left lights on. He hated wasting electricity, even with solar hooked up out there. I leaned forward and looked through the windshield, trying to catch a shadow in the window. Nothing. No movement. The curtains were still the same olive green ones I'd picked up from a garage sale 10 years ago. My eyes lingered on the front step. There was something wrong with the mud. It was darker than it should have been, even for a rainy week. Thick, black soil caked up along the edge like someone had kicked it loose. The engine was still running. I told myself I'd just back up and leave. But then I saw something move behind the cabin. A flicker. Just the tiniest shape cutting across the far edge of the clearing. I jerked forward and stared, but it was already gone. I wasn't thinking straight. I don't know why I shifted into park and stepped out. My boots sank into the soft dirt. The wind carried that cold, wet smell you only get from rotting wood and standing water. I stepped up on the porch, boards creaking beneath my weight. I peered through the window. Nothing. No light inside, just the yellow glow from the porch casting shadows on the walls. The door had new scratches around the knob. Fresh ones, not weathered. I leaned closer and saw that it had been forced once. Recently, I felt something shift in my chest. That's when the fear really started. This wasn't about Caleb anymore. This wasn't curiosity. I realized I was standing in front of a cabin that might have been broken into, maybe still was. If Caleb was here, he could be hurt. If he wasn't, someone else might be squatting inside. Either way, I needed to leave. I backed off the porch, boots sliding a bit in the slick mud, and turned toward the truck. But then I heard the click. Came from behind the cabin. Not a snap like a branch breaking, this was mechanical. A latch, a door maybe. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. The wind pushed through the trees again, and I thought I heard something else. Something dragging through wet leaves. My instincts screamed at me to leave. I turned to go, but something made me look down first. Just beside the steps was a footprint. It wasn't mine. It wasn't Caleb's either. Too small, and barefoot. No tread, just a dirty outline in the wet clay, heel and all, and way too fresh. The water hadn't even started filling it in yet. I ran to the truck, threw it in reverse. Mud sprayed behind me as the tires caught and spun before grabbing hold. The truck fishtailed halfway down the path, and I had to grip the wheel tight to avoid hitting a stump. I didn't stop until I hit the main road again, engine growling as I forced it back toward the highway. I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see someone chasing after me. Nothing did, but the road didn't feel right on the way out. The trees seemed thicker, the shadows deeper. I felt like I was being watched the whole drive back into town. I got to Elkins late that night, shaking, exhausted, and unable to explain to my sister why I looked like I'd seen something I couldn't name. I didn't sleep. The next day, I called a friend of mine who still lived in Morrow Creek. Asked him if he'd heard anything about Caleb. He paused, told me he thought Caleb had moved away years ago, maybe to Fayetteville. No one had seen him in ages. His old job said he just stopped showing up. Didn't say goodbye, didn't leave a number, just vanished. I tried not to think about the footprint, or the flicker of movement behind the cabin, or the sound of the latch. 2 days later, I drove back out during daylight, brought a sheriff's deputy with me, just told him I was checking on a property I used to share. The deputy was polite, calm, but he got real quiet when we reached the cabin. The front door was wide open. Inside, the place was a wreck. Furniture overturned. Cabinets emptied, but nothing stolen. No electronics missing. No signs of squatters sleeping inside. Just a mess. And in the back, the hatch to the cellar had been ripped off. The stairs were broken like someone had fallen hard. At the bottom was a pile of old clothes. Some were Caleb's. Some I didn't recognize. There were scratch marks on the walls. Long, gouging scratches down the plaster. The sheriff told me he'd file a report. Said maybe a bear got in. Or a meth head. But he didn't believe it. I could see it in his face. Before we left, I stepped behind the cabin. That's where I'd seen the shape. The leaves were disturbed. Drag marks, maybe, and not from feet, like something heavy had been pulled. We never found Caleb. No missing persons report was filed. No body, no arrest, no clues. But here's what I know. He didn't leave that cabin willingly. And whoever or whatever was there now, it wasn't him. Not anymore. I never went back. I sold my place in Kansas City and moved west. Bought a small house near the mountains where the air feels dry and clean and the trees don't press in so close. I don't keep any old photos. I don't use GPS anymore. I know exactly where I'm going and I stay far away from dirt roads and broken cabins. I keep my lights on at night. And every now and then, I wake up sweating, heart racing, from a dream I can't remember. But there's always one thing that sticks. The sound of wet feet walking across the porch, one after another, and the door latch clicking shut. It was a rainy night when I found myself alone in the small cabin I had been building for the past few weeks. The storm outside had intensified, the wind howling through the trees like something desperately trying to claw its way into the cabin. I had no business being out here on my own, no real plan to spend the night, but the rain made everything impossible to drive through. The roads were slick with mud, and the trees along the path seemed to lean in closer with every gust of wind, as though they were watching me. This cabin, nestled deep in the woods outside a small town called Brookhaven, had been a project I started after losing my job. I was tired of city life, tired of the hustle. I wanted peace, solitude. So I bought a plot of land, something cheap, far from civilization. The idea was to finish the cabin by spring and maybe live there part-time, something quiet to escape to when life got too overwhelming. That was the plan anyway. Tonight, though, the rain had turned it all into something darker. The small, uninsulated cabin was barely finished. The roof had been patched with tarps to keep the worst of the rain from getting in, and the only light was the small lantern I'd brought with me. The walls were still bare wood, the floor nothing more than rough boards hastily laid down. I didn't mind it. The simplicity gave me a sense of accomplishment. But tonight it felt too empty, too hollow. The wind made it worse, its constant howl pushing the boundaries of what I could ignore. I had no intention of staying the night. I didn't bring enough supplies, and I didn't even have a decent firewood stack yet. But as the rain came down harder, battering the roof like 1,000 fists, I realized it wasn't safe to leave. My truck was a good distance from the cabin, and the mud would make getting back to it treacherous. I sat by the small stove trying to make the best of it. The fire was weak, barely holding on to the logs I threw in. The warmth from the stove did little to chase away the chill in the air, but it was enough to settle my nerves for a bit. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, the only protection I had against the cold that had been creeping in since the storm started. I didn't know why I had chosen this place, why I thought it would be so perfect. Maybe I'd been fooling myself into believing that isolation would be enough to heal the wear and tear life had left on me. I'd wanted to get away from the noise, but now that I was here, it felt like the silence was louder than anything I'd ever heard. The storm continued its relentless battering, the windows shaking under the force of the wind. The sound of rain hitting the roof was nearly deafening, like someone throwing handfuls of gravel at it. I found it oddly unsettling, the way the world outside seemed to be closing in. It was hard to focus on anything other than the rhythmic thudding of the rain. I wasn't sure when it happened. Maybe it was a gust of wind, or maybe it was just the cabin settling. But I heard something, a sound just outside the door. It wasn't the wind. It was a distinct, muffled thud. I froze, my hand hovering over the lantern. I strained my ears, listening for the sound again. Nothing, only the rain. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. A branch falling, maybe, some part of the cabin settling deeper into the ground. But there was no denying the unease that had settled in my chest. I grabbed the lantern, its flickering light casting long shadows across the room. Slowly, I made my way toward the door, heart hammering in my chest. Another thud, louder this time and closer. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the door handle. I hesitated, my hand trembling. Something about the noise didn't sit right with me. It wasn't random. It felt deliberate, like someone or something was out there, waiting for me to make the first move. I opened the door slowly, just a crack, enough to peer outside. The night was black, the only light coming from the lantern in my hand. The wind whipped the rain into my face, stinging my skin. I saw nothing, just the dark, empty expanse of trees and mud. But there was something in the air that made my skin crawl. I stepped outside, the cold, damp earth sucking at my boots with each step. I called out, but my voice seemed to be swallowed by the storm. I walked a few steps away from the door, my eyes darting from side to side. The rain made it hard to see, the droplets blurring my vision. But there was something odd about the way the woods felt. Too quiet, too still. For a moment, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure, perhaps, but it was gone before I could fully register it. I stood there, alone in the rain, trying to ignore the anxiety creeping up my spine. The storm raged on, and all I could hear was the deafening roar of the wind. Nothing else. No more sounds of footsteps or knocks. I was just being paranoid, I told myself. It was just the isolation, the rain. Nothing more. But as I turned to head back inside, I heard it again. A thud, this time much closer. I spun around, the lantern shaking in my hand. My heart was racing, my body on high alert. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but something felt wrong. I was being watched. I could feel it like eyes on the back of my neck. My instincts screamed at me to get back inside, to lock the door and never open it again. I didn't wait. I sprinted back to the cabin, slamming the door behind me and bolting it shut. The sudden silence that followed was suffocating. I stood there, breathless, trying to shake off the panic that had taken hold of me. I told myself I was being foolish. I had no reason to be scared. But the feeling, the sense of being followed, lingered. Couldn't shake it. The storm didn't let up. If anything, it only seemed to grow more intense. The rain kept pounding the roof, and the wind howled like something trying to break through. The hours dragged on, the small cabin feeling more and more like a prison. By the time the storm finally began to die down, I had worn myself out with worry and fear. I hadn't dared to venture outside again, and the thought of doing so made my stomach turn. I stayed huddled by the stove, staring into the weak flames, hoping for morning. When dawn finally came, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a world drenched in water. The trees stood still, their branches heavy with rain, the air thick with humidity. Everything was soaked, the mud thick beneath my boots as I stepped outside. There was no sign of anything. No footprints, no broken branches. Nothing to explain the sounds, the unease that had taken over me the night before. But I knew something had been out there. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The woods were silent now, but the silence was deafening, pressed in on me from all sides. I finished the last of the work on the cabin the next day, though the whole time I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone or something to be watching me. I locked up and left as soon as I could, the drive back to town feeling like a relief. The road, muddy and slick, felt safer than the isolated woods where the storm had nearly consumed me. To this day, I'm not sure what was out there that night. Maybe it was just the cabin playing tricks on me. Maybe it was nothing at all. But as I left that place, I never looked back. And every time I pass through the woods on the road to Brookhaven, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching, waiting. It was the winter of 2017 when I decided to take some time off from everything. I was 38, had been working nonstop in construction management for years, and hadn't had a real break since my early 20s. I'd gone through a breakup a few months earlier, nothing dramatic, but it left me feeling worn down. I wanted to be somewhere quiet, just me and the woods.
No phones, no emails.
I rented out a remote cabin near the Snowline Ridge in British Columbia, about 2 hours north of Kamloops. The listing made it clear there would be no cell signal, no nearby stores, no neighbors. That was exactly what I wanted. I took my dog with me, a 6-year-old black lab named Tucker. He had been with me since he was a puppy and was one of the few steady things in my life. Loyal, quiet, obedient. He'd been on plenty of hikes with me, and I knew he'd handle the woods better than I could. The drive up was long and winding. It was early January, and although the roads were mostly clear, Patches of snow still clung to the trees and ditches. I had packed my truck with everything I'd need: canned food, firewood, a chainsaw, extra propane, a portable heater, and a few books. The cabin had a wood stove, no plumbing, and only a solar panel system for basic lighting. I knew I'd be roughing it, and I was fine with that. The cabin itself was smaller than I'd imagined. One room with a cot, a stove, a small kitchen area, and a table. The outhouse was about 50 feet out back, and there was a small shed for firewood and tools. It wasn't modern, but it was solid. I checked the doors, the windows, everything was in good shape. The first few days were peaceful. I'd wake up, stoke the fire, let Tucker out to sniff around, then cook a simple breakfast on the propane stove. We took long walks through the trees. I didn't follow trails, just wandered, keeping track of the sun's position and landmarks. I was careful not to get too far, since GPS was spotty that deep in the hills, and I told no one exactly where the cabin was, just that I'd be gone for 10 days. By the fourth night, I was sleeping better than I had in months. The kind of deep, dreamless sleep you only get when you're far from everything. I hadn't seen a single person, not even a hunter or snowmobiler. It was perfect, but on the fifth night, something started to feel off. Tucker had been calm the entire trip, sleeping at the foot of the cot or by the stove. But that night, he kept lifting his head and looking toward the door, not barking, just alert. At first I thought it was a deer or maybe a raccoon, but he didn't whine or get excited like he usually did. It was like he was waiting. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside. The temperature had dropped sharply, and the wind had picked up. Snow was coming down lightly. I scanned the clearing around the cabin, nothing. Just trees and the faint glow of snow falling in the beam of the flashlight. Tucker stayed on the porch, ears up. I didn't see anything unusual, but I kept checking throughout the night. Every time I drifted off, I'd wake up to the sound of him moving or growling low in his throat. Not loud, not aggressive, just a warning. The next morning, I walked a slow circle around the cabin. The snow was fresh and undisturbed. No tracks, not even rabbit prints. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. That afternoon, I decided to chop some extra firewood. I moved farther back behind the shed, where the tree line opened up a little more. Tucker followed, sniffing around the stumps and brush. While I was stacking the logs, I noticed something that made me stop. A single tree near the edge of the clearing had deep gouges in its bark, like it had been scratched by something. They weren't claw marks exactly. They looked like something metal had dug into the trunk in long, deliberate lines. I figured it might have been someone marking the tree for cutting, or even an old logging scar, but it looked fresh. The sap hadn't even dried. That night, Tucker refused to sleep near the door. He curled up beside the cot and wouldn't move, even when I called him. I left a lantern on and tried to read, but I was constantly glancing at the windows. Around 2 a.m., I heard it for the first time. Not footsteps, not branches cracking. A low dragging sound, slow and steady, came from behind the cabin, maybe along the shed or the outhouse. Tucker growled, deep and quiet. I got up, grabbed the flashlight and my axe, and went to the back window. Nothing. I couldn't see anything in the snow, and the dragging stopped. I waited, heart thudding, for 10 full minutes before I stepped outside. The snow was still falling, lightly, gently. It was dead quiet. There were marks by the shed, 2 long lines in the snow, as if something heavy had been pulled or dragged across it. The lines came from the woods and stopped by the back of the shed, then disappeared. I followed them about 10 feet into the trees until they just stopped. No other footprints. No animal tracks. I walked back, checked the shed. Nothing missing. Tools all there, locked up. The outhouse door was closed. I went back inside, locked the cabin door, and kept the axe by the cot. Tucker didn't sleep at all. The next day I considered leaving early, But I told myself I was just spooked. Maybe a moose had wandered close. Maybe the snow made things look strange. I didn't want to let fear chase me out. Still, I changed my routine. No more wandering too far from the cabin. I started keeping the axe and flashlight close at all times. Tucker stayed glued to my side. He didn't even want to leave the porch. That night, something banged on the shed. It wasn't loud, just a single metallic thud like someone had hit it with a stick or a pipe. I waited, listening. Then again, thud, metal on metal. I went out, this time with my boots already on and flashlight ready. Tucker stayed right behind me. I circled the cabin, walked up to the shed door, and swung it open. Empty. The tools were untouched. No tracks. The snow by the shed was fresh and clean. That made no sense. There should have been prints, mine or something else's. But there was nothing. I stood there for a long time, heart pounding, listening. Then I heard the dragging again, this time from the front of the cabin. I ran back around and scanned the snow with my light. Just trees. Nothing moved. But there were new tracks. Lines again, long and deep, like something heavy was being pulled. They ran past the porch, along the edge of the cabin, and into the woods again. And again, no footprints. I didn't sleep at all that night. Neither did Tucker. The next day, I decided I'd leave in the morning. It was only 3 days earlier than planned, and I didn't care. I wasn't thinking clearly. I started packing my gear, loading some of it back into the truck. I left the chainsaw and axe in the shed for last. That evening, right before dark, I found something that shook me hard. Back near the tree with the gouges, there was a pile of rocks I hadn't noticed before, stacked neatly about 2 feet tall. Not random, not natural. They had been placed, arranged. Someone had built it. On top was a strip of torn fabric, dark green, with faded stitching. It looked like a piece of a jacket. I kicked the rocks over, sick to my stomach. I felt like I had walked into something I wasn't supposed to see. I grabbed Tucker and went back inside. That night, the cabin was silent.
No dragging. No banging.
Not even wind. I waited until morning, packed the rest of the gear, and got ready to leave. When I went to the shed to grab the chainsaw, I found the shed door wide open. I had locked it the night before. I was sure of it. Inside, the tools were gone. All of them. Axe, saw, shovel. Every piece of metal. Gone. No prints, again. Just snow on the floor. And in the center of the shed, someone had left a dead rabbit. His neck had been broken clean. I drove out of there without looking back. When I got to Kamloops, I checked into a motel and reported what happened to the local detachment. They sent someone out to look, but I never heard what they found, if anything. I didn't go back. I canceled the rest of the cabin booking, didn't even ask for a refund. 3 months later, I got a call from the owner. He said the next guest found the shed empty, except for a pile of rocks in the center. No tools, no sign of animals, just the rocks and what looked like a torn piece of cloth placed on top. He didn't ask me anything else, just said he was going to stop renting the place. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there, but it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't my imagination. I still don't camp alone anymore. I still have Tucker. He's older now, sleeps more, but every once in a while, when we walk past a thick patch of woods, he'll stop, ears up, body tense, and I still keep the axe inside the house, just in case. I was 34 when I decided to take a solo hunting trip up to the old cabin near Moosehead Lake in Maine. I had hunted the area before with my father and uncle growing up, but they'd both long since stopped making the yearly trek. Life just got in the way for them. My father's knees were bad, and my uncle had moved down to Florida. I'd been back once or twice with friends over the years, but this time I wanted to go alone. I needed a break. From the office, from noise, from everything. The cabin was remote, not off-grid exactly, but close to it. No running water, no internet, and if you wanted phone signal, you had to hike a half-mile up a ridge and stand next to a twisted pine that everyone in the family just called the antenna tree. My grandfather had built the place in the 50s, small, sturdy, and functional. One room, a wood stove, a cot, and racks for rifles and gear. Nothing pretty, but it kept you warm and dry. I drove up in my old 2002 Chevy Silverado with a bed full of supplies. Food for a week, fuel for the generator, ammo, my rifle, and a new set of trail cameras I wanted to try out. I pulled in just before sundown on a Wednesday, the air already cooler than it should have been for early October. The trees were turning fast. Maple leaves scattered across the gravel driveway, which was really just two ruts in the dirt from years of tires passing over the same patch. I unlocked the heavy wooden door, flicked on the gas lantern, and stood in silence for a few minutes. The cabin always had that musky wood smell, mixed with gun oil and smoke from the last time the chimney had been used. I laid my gear out, got a small fire going in the stove, and cooked a can of chili. That night, I slept hard. The kind of sleep you only get when you've left behind all the nonsense and noise of everyday life. The first couple of days were uneventful. I hiked to the usual spots. An old deer stand my dad built, a rocky clearing near a stream where bucks liked to pass at dawn, and a small hill we called Bear's Elbow for its shape. I didn't spot much. A couple of does, one red fox, and fresh scat that looked like it belonged to a good-sized black bear. But I wasn't too worried. I wasn't just there to fill a tag. I was there for the quiet. I set up the trail cameras on day 2. One facing the tree line near Bear's Elbow, another along the deer path by the creek, and a third mounted on a tree just 50 yards behind the cabin, pointing toward the rear clearing. I figured I'd check them every other day. I wasn't expecting much, but it was nice to get a look at the activity when I wasn't around. On the third night, I woke up cold. The fire in the stove had gone out, which wasn't unusual. But what was odd was that I woke up to nothing. Usually, even out here, you could hear the wind or a raccoon or branches settling. That night, it was still. So still that I could hear the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. I sat up on the cot, pulled on a flannel shirt, and added more wood to the stove. As I stood there feeding the fire, I thought I heard a faint crack, like a branch snapping in the distance. Not loud, but sharp. It was close enough to raise the hair on my arms. I waited, not moving, just listening. But nothing followed. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just a branch falling from one of the big pines. Still, I left the lantern on that night, just in case. The next morning, I went out to check the trail cams. The one near the creek had a doe and her fawn passing through around dusk. The Bear's Elbow cam caught a coyote sniffing the air and then backing away like something had spooked it. But the third one, the one behind the cabin, had a different kind of footage. The first few frames were nothing, just wind and movement from trees. Then around 2:47 a.m., there was motion. Something tall moved along the far edge of the frame. Just a sliver of movement, like a shoulder brushing past. I replayed it over and over, but the clip was short and the angle was poor. Whatever it wasn't a bear. It was upright, and it was close, within maybe 20 yards of the cabin. Could have been another hunter. Maybe someone got lost or was walking through in the dark. But that didn't sit right with me. Nobody came this far without meaning to. There weren't any other cabins within miles. And the way it moved, it didn't feel like someone lost. I reset the camera and went back inside. I cleaned my rifle. I made lunch. I read an old magazine. But all day, I kept looking out the back window toward the woods. My brain kept repeating that clip in my head. Whatever it was had been too close. That night, I stayed awake. I didn't mean to, but I couldn't relax. The woods had changed. They didn't sound like they usually did. I didn't hear owls,
No crickets.
just the occasional gust of wind and creaking trees. Around midnight, I killed the lantern and sat in the dark with the rifle across my lap, facing the back window. And then I heard the noise again, a crack, a snap, then 2 heavy steps on dry leaves. I didn't move. My eyes were adjusted to the dark, and I stared through the window toward the clearing. Nothing, but I could feel something, that pressure in your chest when you're being watched. I waited like that for nearly an hour, then silence again. At dawn, I finally stood and went out with my rifle. I circled the cabin, checking the area. That's when I saw the prints. They weren't boot prints, and they weren't bare. They were wide but human-shaped, bare feet, toes and all. Clear as day in the soft soil just 10 feet from the trail cam tree. I followed them for maybe 30 yards before they disappeared into hard pine ground. Someone had been there, watching, in the cold, in the dark, barefoot. I should have left that day, but I didn't. I told myself it was just some nutcase or maybe someone off their meds wandering the woods. I was armed, I was experienced, and I wasn't going to be scared out of my family's cabin by some weirdo. So I stayed. On day 5, I went deeper into the woods to clear my head and get away from the cabin. I hiked 5 miles west, past an old logging trail and into terrain I didn't know well. I saw a few squirrels, 1 hawk, and what looked like the remains of a campfire at a dried-out riverbed. The fire was old, maybe weeks old, but someone else had been there, probably just another hunter. When I got back around dusk, I noticed something right away. The trail cam behind the cabin was gone. Not knocked loose, gone. The mount was still there, but the camera had been taken clean off. The screw was unscrewed, not broken. Someone had removed it. I searched the area but found nothing. Inside the cabin, I did something I hadn't done since I was a kid. I moved the cot in front of the door and kept the rifle in my hands. I didn't sleep. I stared out the window for hours, until sunrise painted the trees gray and then gold. I felt like I was being hunted, not by an animal, by something smarter. The next day, I packed everything. The whole trip was meant to be a week, but I was done. I stuffed my gear into the truck, loaded the remaining trail cams, and got ready to go. When I turned the key, the engine didn't turn over, just a click. I checked the battery. The terminals were clean. I opened the hood, and that's when I saw the wires. They'd been cut, not chewed, cut, clean, snipped with something sharp. I stood there, not moving, not breathing for a moment. Someone had disabled my truck. I went back into the cabin and locked the door. I pushed the cot back against it and set the rifle on the table. I knew I couldn't stay much longer. I had some food, but I didn't like being trapped. I checked the satellite phone I kept in my pack.
No battery.
I hadn't charged it. That was on me. I spent the rest of the day boiling water, sharpening my knife, and going over the map. The nearest ranger station was roughly 12 miles east, across uneven ground. If I left at dawn, I could make it in a day. That night was the longest night of my life. The footsteps started around 2 a.m., slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. Not animals, not a bear, human. They stopped at the windows. I heard breathing. Something brushed the wall outside, fingertips or maybe a branch. I stayed still with the rifle pointed at the door, heart hammering in my chest. They didn't try the door. They didn't smash a window, just walked around. For hours. At sunrise, they were gone. I left everything but the rifle, a backpack with water and a flashlight, and my boots. I didn't bother locking the door. I just hiked east. I made it to the ranger station just before nightfall. I was dehydrated and shaking. They called in a truck to tow mine. When they went out there 3 days later, the cabin had been ransacked. Nothing valuable taken, just scattered gear and footprints everywhere. The cot was slashed open. The trail cam was found snapped in two, 50 yards into the woods. They never caught whoever it was. I never went back to that cabin. I sold the land a year later. I still hunt, but not alone. Not anymore, and never that deep in the woods. Not after what I saw. Not after what followed me home. Because 2 weeks later, in the middle of the night, I found a single footprint in the dirt outside my garage. Barefoot, white, human-shaped. It had rained the night before. All the other prints were washed away, except that one. It was early October 2012 when my old friend Sean asked me for a favor. He owned a piece of land deep in the mountains of southern Colorado, not too far from Pagosa Springs. I was living in Albuquerque at the time, doing handyman jobs here and there, just trying to get by. Sean and I hadn't seen each other in years, but he called out of the blue. He'd started building a cabin on his land, a kind of off-grid getaway, and he needed someone to stay out there for a night or two while a shipment of materials arrived, just to make sure nothing got stolen. He was offering $500 for one night. I said yes before he finished explaining. I figured it'd be cold. Sure, but a few hours in a sleeping bag inside a half-built cabin didn't sound too bad. Plus, the cash would help me pay rent that month. He gave me a basic layout of the place and left a printed map at a gas station off Highway 160. The cabin, he told me, didn't have power yet, just a wood stove and a cot inside. There was no running water and no cell service once you got into the valley. But the truck with supplies was set to show up around 7 a.m. the next morning, and all I had to do was be there. I packed light, just a flashlight, a utility knife, a few protein bars, a thermos of coffee, and my thick sleeping bag. I left Albuquerque around 10 a.m., drove north through Santa Fe, and crossed into Colorado a little after lunch. It was about 3 p.m. when I turned off onto the old logging road that led to his land. The road was rough. I had to drive 5 miles in low gear, crawling over rocks and dodging potholes. Pine trees grew thick on both sides, and I didn't pass a single vehicle. There were no signs, no cabins, no fences. It was just woods. Finally, I came to a small clearing with tire tracks in the dirt and a wide rectangular shape of gravel where the cabin sat. The building wasn't much. It was made of raw pine logs, not yet stained or sealed, with a tin roof that looked freshly hammered into place. There was one door, one window with no glass, and a stovepipe poking out from the back. I parked beside it and stepped out. The air was crisp. Not a sound around me but the wind in the trees and the crunch of gravel under my boots. Inside the cabin, the floor was plywood. There was a metal cot in the corner, and a small pile of chopped wood stacked against the far wall. The wood stove looked new. I tested the door. It swung open smoothly and latched shut with a heavy iron hook. There were no lights. I had my flashlight, though, and it worked fine. I started a fire in the stove using the kindling Sean had left behind, then unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot. The place smelled like pine and cold steel. It wasn't cozy, but it was enough. I walked the perimeter a few times to kill time. There was a trail behind the cabin that led down a short slope to a dry creek bed. No water, just smooth stones and dead leaves. No sign of animals either, no deer tracks, no scat, nothing. As it got darker, I returned to the cabin, bolted the door shut, and sat near the stove drinking lukewarm coffee. The fire hissed and popped. I had no cell signal, no book, nothing to distract me. Just the slow creep of night outside. Around 8 p.m., I lay down on the cot and zipped myself into the bag. I wasn't tired, but there wasn't anything else to do. I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes again, it was pitch black and the fire was out. My watch said 11:34 p.m. That's when I first heard the sound. It was faint, like someone stepping on dry twigs, not an animal scurrying. A slow, deliberate crunching. I held my breath. Came again, then again. Footsteps, I sat up fast, heart pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the window. Nothing. I turned off the beam and waited, listening. The sound came again, closer. It stopped just outside the cabin wall. I didn't call out. I didn't move. Then I heard it again, but now behind the cabin. Whoever it was had circled around. I pulled on my boots without unlacing them. My knife was still in my coat pocket, so I gripped it and moved toward the door, still silent. The footsteps stopped again. Then a soft scrape, like fingers dragging across the cabin wall. I wanted to believe it was the wind. I even convinced myself it was a bear, but the steps were too steady, too quiet. Bears don't walk slowly around buildings in a half circle. I stayed frozen near the door for what felt like an hour, but probably was 5 minutes. No more sounds came. Nothing moved outside. Eventually, I forced myself to sit back down, flashlight aimed at the window. I didn't sleep. I just stared into the darkness, listening. Around 2:30 a.m., it happened again. But this time, the steps were heavier. I could hear breathing outside. Came right up to the window, then stopped. I pointed the flashlight. Nothing. Just the pale yellow beam against pine trunks and empty air. But I swear I'd heard someone standing there. After that, I didn't sit anymore. I stood, back to the corner, gripping my knife and watching the door. Then the handle moved, just a slight twitch, but it was enough. The door was still bolted, but whoever was out there tried it, just once. Then they walked away, slowly, back into the trees. I didn't chase. I didn't speak. At first light, I opened the door and stepped out, knife still in hand. The cold air hit me like a slap. There were footprints, real ones, human. They circled the cabin twice, then veered off into the woods behind the dry creek bed. I followed them only about 20 feet before I stopped. They led toward a small cluster of trees and disappeared. No vehicle tracks.
No campfire.
Nothing. Just woods. I walked back to the cabin, locked the door again, and waited. The delivery truck showed up a little after 7 a.m. A white pickup hauling a trailer full of sheet metal and lumber. 2 guys stepped out. They waved, asked if I was Sean's buddy. I just nodded. After they unloaded, I didn't stick around. I left the cabin exactly as I'd found it, with stacked, door bolted, sleeping bag rolled. I drove out fast, not even stopping at the turnoff. Sean called me later that day to thank me. I told him the job was done, but I didn't mention anything else. 2 weeks later, he called again. Someone had broken into the cabin. They'd busted the stove, slashed the cot, and left a dead squirrel nailed to the inside of the door. That was the last time I heard from him. I never went back to that place. Sometimes I wonder who was out there that night. Maybe just some local messing with me. Maybe someone who didn't want strangers around. But the way they moved, the way they waited out there, circling in the dark, it didn't feel like a prank. It felt like a warning. I don't camp alone anymore. I don't take jobs like that. And I sure as hell don't sleep in unfinished cabins in the middle of nowhere. That one night changed the way I think about being alone in the woods. Because out there, miles from anyone, if someone wants to hurt you, there's nobody coming to help. It was a cold evening in mid-October when I found myself driving down the narrow, winding roads of the English countryside. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, and the moon barely cast a light through the thick clouds that hung low in the sky. I had come to this remote cabin, tucked away in the rolling hills of the Peak District, to clear my mind and get some peace away from the hustle and bustle of city life. It wasn't the most luxurious getaway, but I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a simple, quiet place to rest. The cabin had been in the family for decades, passed down from my great-grandfather to my father, and now to me. The idea was to spend a weekend alone, disconnecting from everything and getting some rest in the serene isolation. The cabin itself was old, made of dark, weathered wood that looked almost black in the moonlight. It sat on the edge of a small forest, with trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance. The occasional rustle of leaves and the hoot of an owl were the only sounds that broke the silence. I parked my old Land Rover in front of the cabin and grabbed my bags from the trunk. The air was sharp and cold, and the wind tugged at my jacket as I hurried inside. I was alone, just the way I wanted it. No phone signal, no internet, no distractions. Inside, the cabin had an old-world charm to it. The wooden beams in the ceiling were exposed, and a stone fireplace sat in the center of the room. The furniture was mismatched, some pieces old and worn, others more modern, but it all had a certain coziness. I immediately stoked the fire to warm up the place, the crackling of the logs filling the otherwise quiet room. I settled in for the night, unpacking my things and making myself comfortable. It had been a long drive and I was exhausted. The plan was simple: sleep, rest, and maybe take a hike in the morning. But as the fire flickered in the hearth and the wind howled outside, I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. It wasn't a strong feeling, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to the isolation, the unfamiliar place, and the time of year. But that night, as I lay in bed, something felt off. The floorboards creaked in a way that made it sound like someone was walking around outside. I assumed it was just the wind, but when I heard a faint tapping on the window, I froze. It was a slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap. I lay there in the dark, trying to tell myself it was just the branches of a tree, but there was no denying the unmistakable rhythm of the tapping. It sounded too precise. I slipped out of bed, moving quietly across the room. My heart raced in my chest as I crept toward the window. I pulled back the heavy curtains, half expecting to see the wind pushing branches against the glass. But there was nothing there. The night outside was pitch black, with only the faintest outline of the trees swaying in the breeze. I shook my head, frustrated with myself for getting worked up over nothing. I returned to bed and tried to sleep, but the tapping persisted. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind again, but it didn't stop. It was like it was right there, just outside the window. The sound grew louder, and I couldn't take it any longer. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and headed outside, determined to find the source of the noise. The cold air hit me hard as soon as I stepped outside, and I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. I scanned the dark yard, shining the flashlight across the ground and up into the trees. There was nothing. No animals, no wind-blown branches, just the deep silence of the night. But the tapping continued. It was coming from the cabin itself. I approached the back of the cabin cautiously, the light cutting through the darkness. The tapping grew louder as I moved closer to the old wooden door that led into the small storage room at the back. The door was ajar, just a crack, and the tapping was coming from inside. My breath caught in my throat. I shouldn't have opened the door. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and go back inside, but something drove me forward, a mix of curiosity and fear. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside the small room, the moonlight barely filtered through the window. The light from my flashlight danced across the dusty floor, and I froze. There, standing in the far corner, was a woman. She was hunched over, her back to me, her long, tangled hair falling over her face. She wore a thin, faded dress that barely covered her knees, and her feet were bare, dirty, as if she had been wandering through the woods. Her body was unnaturally still, as if she were waiting for something. I couldn't move. My body felt like it was frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. I should have run, should have screamed, but I couldn't. The silence in the room was deafening. and then she moved. Her head slowly turned toward me, and I could barely see her face in the dim light, but her eyes, those eyes, were wide and empty, like two hollow pits staring straight into my soul. They were too big, too dark, and they didn't blink. I felt a chill run through me, deeper than the cold night air. Couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I was trapped in that moment, unable to look away from those eyes. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she began to stand. She didn't make a sound as she rose to her full height, and her limbs moved with an unnatural slowness, as if she were still not quite real. I snapped out of my daze, my body suddenly flooded with adrenaline. I turned and ran, stumbling out of the room and slamming the door behind me. I could hear her footsteps behind me, soft but relentless, following as I sprinted into the yard. My heart raced in my chest, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road. I looked back only once, and I didn't see her. There was no sign of the woman. I didn't know if I was just imagining it, but the fear in my chest felt too real to be a trick of my mind. The rest of the night was a blur. I barely slept, too afraid to return to the cabin. The next morning, I packed my things and left without looking back. I don't know what I saw in that cabin, but I knew one thing for sure: I was never going back. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The cabin was there, standing silent and still, just as it had always been. But I knew better now. Something was off about that place. And whatever I had seen, whatever was lingering there in the dark, was something I never wanted to encounter again. I never told anyone about what happened that night. Not because I thought they wouldn't believe me, but because I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. All I knew was that I didn't want to go near that cabin again. Some things, no matter how hard you try, are better left in the dark. It was late September 2014, and the leaves had just started to turn in the northern part of Maine. I was 38 then, worn down from the kind of life where work never stops calling and sleep always feels like a suggestion, not a necessity. I had spent the last 12 years in Boston, working for a small architecture firm, and to say I needed a break was an understatement. My heart wasn't in it anymore. I wanted to get away, be alone, and figure out what came next. That's when I thought about the old family cabin. The place had belonged to my uncle, Ray. He died in 1997. My dad and I used to go up there every summer for a week or two when I was a kid. It sat maybe 45 minutes off any paved road, deep in a patch of state forest no one paid attention to anymore. After Ray passed, the place just sat. No one maintained it, no one sold it, and no one wanted it. When I brought it up to my dad, he just shook his head and said, "Place should have rotted to the ground by now," but it hadn't. I checked the satellite view and, sure enough, it still had a roof and a vague, rectangular shape surrounded by trees. That was good enough for me. I packed up my truck with 3 weeks worth of gear, food, bottled water, a small generator, tools, 2 tarps, and enough clothing to handle any weather. I also brought a pump-action shotgun, not because I expected trouble, but because it made me feel better. You get deep enough in the woods, you want something heavier than bug spray. The first 2 hours of the drive were nothing. I left Boston early, got through the back roads of New Hampshire before sunrise, and hit the dirt trails past Brewer by noon. From there, it got rough. Trees closed in like a tunnel, branches scraped the truck, and the dirt road had turned to rock and mud by the time I reached the final trailhead. I hiked the last mile with a pack and hauled the rest on a collapsible sled over 2 trips. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked almost exactly like I remembered, just weather-beaten and sinking into the land a bit. The front porch was still there, though some of the boards had popped loose. The main door was intact but swollen from years of humidity and had to be forced open with a crowbar. Inside smelled like dust and old wood. No animals had moved in, which surprised me. No raccoons or squirrels or anything. It was just empty, quiet in a way I forgot the world could be. I set up camp inside the cabin itself. There was no point pitching a tent. The structure was solid, 2 small rooms, one with a wood stove and a bed frame, and the other with an old bench table, 2 chairs, and some shelves. No power, of course.
No plumbing.
But it was dry, and the roof didn't leak. I swept the place out, set up the generator out back for lights at night, and stored my food in a plastic crate hung from the ceiling, high enough to discourage anything with teeth. The first few days were perfect. I hiked during the day and sat on the porch with coffee in the mornings and bourbon at night. No cell service, no traffic.
No voices.
Felt like I'd stepped outside of time. I sketched a little, wrote in a notebook, even managed to sleep through the night for the first time in months. Then, on the 5th night, I woke up around 2 in the morning. There was a sound, faint but sharp. It wasn't the wind, not a branch breaking or an animal moving. It sounded like metal, a short clang like something had been struck once, maybe 50 feet from the cabin. I lay there for a long minute, heart ticking faster than it should, listening for anything else. Nothing came. I almost convinced myself I imagined it. The kind of half-dream noise your brain invents when you're in unfamiliar places. I stayed awake for another hour, but nothing moved. Nothing breathed out there. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and did a sweep of the area. The trees were still. No signs of animals or people. I checked my food crate, it hadn't been touched. The generator was untouched too, though I found one small thing that set my nerves on edge. Behind the cabin, down by a moss-covered boulder, I saw marks in the dirt. 3 lines, side by side, about 5 feet long. They were shallow, like something had been dragged. Not tire tracks, more like someone had scraped long pieces of rebar through the mud. No prints nearby, just those lines, leading out into the trees before they faded. I told myself it could have been anything. A deer maybe dragging a branch, or weather doing something weird. But even as I told myself that, I knew it didn't sit right. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept the lantern on, door locked, and the shotgun leaning next to the bed. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I didn't feel alone anymore. Not completely. On the 7th night, things got worse. I was just about to fall asleep when I heard it again, that same sharp clang of metal. But this time, it came from right outside the cabin, maybe 5 feet from the window. I froze, every part of me going still. My breath felt loud in my own ears. The noise didn't come again, but I heard the crunch of dead leaves underfoot. Slow, deliberate. Something or someone was moving out there. I stayed quiet, trying to hear more, but whatever was out there wasn't making a sound anymore. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Could have been 5 minutes, could have been 30. Eventually, I reached out, grabbed the shotgun, and crept to the window. I lifted the edge of the curtain just an inch. The moon was full, and the trees were washed in silver. But I didn't see anything.
No chaps. No motion.
Still, I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found something worse. Out behind the cabin, just past the boulder, there was a tree with deep gashes in the bark. 6 of them, all parallel, maybe 2 inches apart. They were too clean for animals. Looked like something with claws or blades. Below that, in the dirt, the dragging marks had returned. Longer this time, and beside them, for the first time, I saw a partial boot print. Not mine, not recent either, but fresh enough to still be visible. That day, I went deeper into the woods with my compass, circling out from the cabin to see if I could find anything. After about an hour, I found an old path I didn't remember from childhood. It had been partially swallowed by forest, but the ground was packed in a way that told me someone still used it now and then. I followed it for half a mile and came to a clearing I hadn't known existed. At the far edge, there was another structure. Not a full cabin, more like a shack. Its roof sagged and the sides were covered in peeling tar paper. I approached slow, gun held down but ready. The place stank like mildew and something else, something sharp and chemical. I circled around and found the door ajar. Inside, it was bare except for a table, a small cot, and what looked like butcher hooks nailed to the wall. Stained canvas sheets were folded in the corner, and on the table were tools: a hacksaw, bolt cutters, a long, narrow knife that looked handmade. I backed out and left fast. I didn't run, but my legs wanted to. Back at the cabin, I started packing. I told myself I'd give it one more night, just to rest before hiking out at first light. But I didn't want to sleep. I felt watched even inside. That night, I stayed dressed, boots on, and kept the shotgun on my lap. I turned the lantern off after 9 and sat in the dark. Around midnight, it started. First a rustle outside, then a tap soft, like fingers on wood, came from the side of the cabin. Then another tap on the opposite side. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then something heavy hit the front porch. Not just a step, more like a drop. I heard the boards creak. Whatever it was stood there for a full minute, maybe more. Then footsteps, slow, across the porch, to the door. Then nothing. I don't know how long I sat there. The footsteps never retreated. They just stopped. At the door. I waited until morning, until the sky began to turn gray. Then I moved. I grabbed my bag, kept the gun ready, and slipped out the back. No one was out there. The trees were still. The air was cold. But on the porch, I saw them. 3 long, thin nails, laid side by side on the boards. I didn't touch them. I didn't look back. Took me 3 hours to reach the truck. I drove until I reached a gas station with people, lights, noise. I didn't sleep again for 2 days. I kept thinking about the cabin, that shack, the dragging marks, the gashes in the tree, and the nails, left like a message. I never went back. I reported it anonymously, told the local sheriff's department that I found an illegal hunting shack in the woods and gave coordinates. I never heard anything back, and I didn't follow up. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to leave it behind. It's been 11 years. I still go camping, but never alone, and never near that part of Maine. And sometimes, when I wake up too early and it's still dark outside, I hear it again in my head. That sound, the tap on the wood, the creak of the porch, and I think about whoever or whatever was standing at that door, just waiting. It was late September 2013. I was 31, working maintenance at a distribution center in Southern Oregon. At the time, I was going through a rough patch. My girlfriend of 4 years had moved out just a few months before. My younger brother had recently moved to Montana, and I'd never felt more alone. I wasn't drinking much, but the nights felt heavy, and I found myself going through the motions every day like I wasn't really awake. A guy at work, Nick, mentioned his cousin had a cabin up near Lake Selmac, just sitting and used most of the year. I barely spoke to Nick outside of work, but for whatever reason, when I told him I just needed to get away for a while, he offered me the key. Said it was bare bones but had a propane stove, a water tank, and a fire pit out back. No cell service. No neighbors for a couple miles. Sounded like exactly what I needed. I got the key from him that Friday, packed up the old Tacoma, threw a couple rifles behind the seat, brought a cooler, some dry food, 2 5-gallon jugs of water, and enough firewood for 3 days. The drive out was maybe 3.5 hours, mostly back roads and dusty Forest Service roads with no signage. The kind of place you could drive past twice and never see. The cabin sat in a flat basin surrounded by dense pine. No power lines.
No fencing.
Just a small structure tucked into the trees. weathered and gray like it had been there for 50 years. The door was a heavy wooden slab with 2 metal locks. Windows were thick and coated in grime. There was an old shed about 20 feet away, nearly collapsing, but the cabin itself looked solid. Inside was musty but cleaner than I expected. Small cot in the corner, propane stove with a metal counter, a wood stove with a rusted stovepipe that bent up through the roof, a shelf with canned food, some of it expired by a decade. Mice had been there for sure, but it looked like no one had stayed there in a while. It was quiet, that kind of silence that you don't notice until it's broken. No cars,
No humming free.
just wind and the creak of the trees. That first night, I sat by the fire out back and stared up at the stars. They were so bright you could see the edges of the Milky Way. I hadn't realized how far removed I'd become from this kind of stillness. I stayed up late, drinking a couple of warm beers from the cooler and listening to the wood pop and hiss. Just after midnight, I thought I heard something behind the cabin. A short, sharp noise, like a foot snapping a twig. I froze, listening. Nothing followed it. I stood up and walked around with my flashlight, but didn't see anything. Probably a deer, I told myself, or a raccoon. That kind of thing happened a lot during that trip, especially at night. Sounds, movements, small things, never dramatic, just enough to keep me slightly on edge. But it was the kind of unease you could talk yourself out of. The kind that builds slowly instead of jumping out at you. By the second day, I'd hiked out a bit. There were no clear trails, just game paths and dry creek beds. I found a logging road that looked like it hadn't been used in years, but nothing else. I didn't see a single other person. It started to feel like I was the only person left on Earth, in a good way. That night, I cooked rice and beans on the little stove and turned in early. No fire. I was too tired. The wind howled a bit around the cabin that night, and the trees creaked constantly. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to what I thought was something brushing against the outside wall of the cabin. A scraping sound, low to the ground, and steady. Not fast, not hard, just deliberate. I held my breath. The cabin was small enough that I could hear everything. I reached over to my pack, grabbed my flashlight, and sat still. The scraping stopped. I got up, checked the windows. Nothing. I opened the door and stepped out barefoot, light in hand. Shined it around the base of the wall where I heard the noise. Nothing there but leaves and a few old pine cones. I waited out there for a few minutes, but the wind picked up and made it hard to hear anything else. I went back in, but I barely slept. By the third day, something had shifted. The silence was different. It wasn't peaceful anymore. Felt like it was watching me. I can't explain it better than that. Like something out there knew I was alone. Knew I was off the grid. Knew I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going. I started to feel stupid for not checking in. Around late afternoon, I noticed something strange about the shed. I glanced at it a dozen times already. But that time, I realized the door wasn't hanging the same way. It had been tilted off the bottom hinge, but now it was open, just a crack. I went over, thinking maybe the wind had caught it. But when I pulled it open fully, I saw something that made my stomach twist. In the dirt floor, in the middle of the shed, were footprints. Bare feet, human-shaped, but wrong. Toes too long, heel too narrow, and deep enough to mean whoever made them was heavy. I stepped back, shut the door, and walked back to the cabin. I didn't run, but I moved fast, locked the door behind me, and loaded the .30-30 lever action I'd brought. I stayed inside the rest of that evening, too rattled to light a fire. That night was worse. I didn't sleep. I kept hearing the leaves crunching. Faint, soft steps around the cabin, just once or twice every half hour, like someone was circling it slow. No animal does that. No deer moves in circles for hours. I told myself maybe it was a bear, but that didn't explain the footprints. Just before dawn, I heard the worst sound of my life. Came from behind the cabin. A low groan that turned into what almost sounded like a person trying to speak with a broken jaw. Words that weren't words. Tones that were too human to be an animal but too off to be a person. It went on for about 10 seconds, then silence. Not even wind. I sat there with the rifle across my lap, too scared to move, too scared to look, just waiting for the light. As soon as the sun came up, I packed. Fast. Tossed everything into the truck, didn't bother folding the cot or cleaning up. I locked the cabin out of habit, then started down the road. I'd made it maybe 3 miles before I saw something standing just off the tree line to the left. Tall, long arms, gray skin.
No clothes.
Just standing there, still, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I didn't even look in the mirror. I didn't tell anyone when I got back. Not really. I just gave Nick the key back and said thanks. Told him it was too quiet for me. That was it. 2 years later, I looked up that area again. Read a few things online from other hikers and hunters who'd been in the region. Reports of strange noises, disappearances, stories of something watching campsites from the woods. Most were passed off as urban legends. One post caught my eye. A guy said he lived near Cave Junction and that his dogs refused to go into certain parts of the forest. He said he found tracks, barefoot prints in the snow where no person should have been walking. I don't know what I saw or what was out there. I'm not saying it was a skinwalker because I don't believe in that stuff the way people mean it. But I do believe there are people, maybe not people anymore, who've lived too long out there in the woods, too far from anything normal. Things that know how to move without being seen. Things that watch. Things that wait. Whatever it wasn't just passing through. It lives out there. I've never gone back to that region. Never went camping alone again. That trip didn't heal me like I hoped it would. But in a strange way, it helped me snap out of whatever rut I was in. Because when you've stared down something that doesn't make sense, something that reminds you how small and vulnerable you really are, it changes what you care about, pulls you out of your own head, and it makes you appreciate the kind of fear that keeps you alive. It was early November 2016 when I decided to take some time off and spend a few weeks alone in the old farm cabin that belonged to my uncle. The place was tucked deep in Pine Hollow, a rural stretch of land in northern Pennsylvania. The closest town, Graywater, was about 40 minutes away by car, and even that town barely had a gas station and a diner. I was 34 back then, burned out from my warehouse job, going through a breakup, and just tired of city noise. My uncle had passed the previous spring, and the cabin had been left untouched since. I figured it would be a good place to clear my head, get away from my phone, maybe even get some writing done. The drive up was long and winding. By the time I got there, a cold fog was creeping in from the woods, rolling across the gravel like spilled milk. I pulled up beside the cabin in my rusted-out Tacoma and killed the engine. The cabin was built sometime in the early 1950s. It had 2 rooms, a main area with a wood stove, kitchenette, and a creaky old cot, and a back room used mostly for storing tools and junk. The outhouse was about 40 feet out the back, just past the edge of the tree line. There was no electricity, no running water, no cell service. Just me, a generator I hadn't started in years, and the sound of the woods breathing around me. The first night was quiet. I unpacked a few supplies. Canned soup, a cooler of water, a few tools, a .22 rifle, a notebook, and some paperbacks. I set the cot up by the window and started a fire in the stove. It didn't take long for that deep, rich heat to fill the room. I sat with my back against the wall, watching the fire and listening to the wind move through the trees. The next morning, I took a walk around the property. The land stretched for about 50 acres, mostly overgrown fields and forest. There was a collapsed barn to the west and an old wire fence that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I spotted deer tracks, some rabbit prints, and what I thought might be coyote scat near the edge of the cornfield, which had been left to die out years ago. It was peaceful, isolated, exactly what I'd hoped for. But on the third day, something felt off. It started when I went out to check the generator behind the cabin. I'd been using candles and the stove for light and heat, but I figured I might as well get the generator running in case I needed to charge my flashlight or radio. When I got to it, I noticed that the fuel line had been cut. Not frayed, not chewed, cut. Clean through, like someone had used a knife. I crouched down, staring at it for a long while. Then I looked around. Nothing, just trees, quiet. Still, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I told myself it must have been chewed by an animal. Maybe it just looked cut. But I knew better. I'd seen what chewed plastic looked like. This wasn't that. Later that night, as I was reading by lantern light, I heard footsteps outside. Not animals, not the wind. Real, heavy, human footsteps, moving slowly across the porch. I froze. The sound stopped, then started again, this time moving around the side of the cabin. I reached for the rifle and sat there, barely breathing. After a few minutes, the footsteps faded away. I stayed awake all night. In the morning, I found boot prints in the dirt outside. Big ones. Work boots, maybe size 12 or 13. They circled the cabin once, then veered off into the woods behind the tool shed. I followed them for about 40 yards until they disappeared into the brush. The worst part? There were no tire tracks, no signs of a car, a bike, anything. Whoever it was had either walked in from the woods or was already out here. I stood there for a long time, listening to the silence, then headed back and nailed the door shut from the inside with a few extra boards I found in the storage room. By the 6th day, I stopped sleeping properly. I would doze off in short bursts, waking up to sounds I couldn't explain. Shuffling outside, a light knock on the back wall, the crunch of leaves near the outhouse. One night, I found a pile of stacked stones just outside the front door. 3 flat rocks balanced carefully on top of one another. They hadn't been there when I went to bed. I knocked them over and kicked them out into the yard. But the next morning, they were back. Same stones, same pattern, right in front of the door again. I started making trips into the woods during the day, trying to spot signs of whoever was out there. I found a few things. A tree with a large, square section of bark scraped off, a broken hunting blind about 200 yards south, and what looked like the remains of a fire pit with fresh ash.
No footprints. No gear.
Nothing human left behind. And yet I knew someone was out there. One night, after another round of distant footsteps, I decided to stay up and watch. I turned off the lantern and waited in the dark. Around 2 a.m., I saw movement. A figure, tall and broad, moving between the trees. I only caught glimpses, but it was definitely a person. They were walking slowly, almost like they were patrolling the area. At one point, they stopped and looked right toward the cabin. I ducked down behind the windowsill and held my breath. They didn't come closer. After a few minutes, they walked away and vanished into the trees. The next morning, I found something new. The back door had been scratched. Not clawed, scratched. Like someone had taken a nail or a piece of metal and dragged it down the wood in long, shallow arcs. 5 of them, almost like tally marks. I packed my bag. I didn't care if it was 7 a.m. or freezing cold. I was ready to leave. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the truck didn't start. Not even a click. I popped the hood. The battery was gone. Gone. Completely removed. I stood there staring at the empty compartment, too stunned to react. I knew right then that I wasn't dealing with some drifter or lost hunter. Someone had been watching me, waiting, planning. And now they'd made sure I couldn't leave. The next 48 hours were a blur of fear. I kept the rifle loaded, slept in short bursts, ate barely anything. Every sound made my heart race. I moved a dresser in front of the door and kept a fire going in the stove to mask the noise of my movements. On the final night, everything came to a head. It was past midnight. I was sitting on the cot with the rifle across my lap when I heard it. A soft tap on the window, then another, then a third. I turned slowly and saw a face. Just for a second. The man was standing right up against the glass, staring in. He had a beard, sunken eyes, and wore a thick coat. Then he stepped back and disappeared into the dark. I jumped to my feet, heart slamming in my chest. I aimed the rifle at the door and waited. Nothing happened. Then I heard it wood cracking from the back of the cabin. I ran to the rear room and found the window wide open. I hadn't even noticed it was unlocked. I aimed into the darkness, but saw nothing. Still, I could feel it. He was in the cabin. I backed up slowly into the main room, keeping the rifle trained toward the back. Then I saw movement by the door. I fired. The sound was deafening in that small space. Smoke filled the air. I ran forward, threw open the door, and bolted into the woods. I didn't stop running until I hit the dirt road that led to Greywater. I ran until my lungs were on fire. At dawn, a farmer found me collapsed near his driveway. I was shaking, covered in mud and ash, babbling about someone in the woods. They brought me into town. The sheriff drove back to the cabin with me. It was empty, no signs of forced entry.
No footprints.
But they did find one thing, a battery. My truck's battery, sitting right there on the front seat. I left that day and never went back. A few months later, I sold the land for cheap. Some guy from out of state bought it for hunting. I never heard what happened to him. Maybe he never had a problem. Maybe the man in the woods had already moved on. But I still think about it sometimes. Late at night when I hear a sound I can't explain, or when I catch movement out the corner of my eye. I still think about that face in the window, the scratches on the door, the stones. There was no ghost.
No monster.
Just a man. And somehow that's what makes it worse. He was real, and he's still out there somewhere. It was the fall of 2018 when I agreed to take the job. I was 34 years old at the time, single, and in between steady work. I had just left a concrete finishing crew in Rochester and was looking for something quieter. My cousin worked for a land development firm out of Missouri and had been nagging me for months to come help on a short-term project out near a place called Haversville, about 45 minutes southeast of Kansas City. I didn't know much about the town, and to be honest, I didn't care. It was work, paid. That was enough. The job itself wasn't anything complicated. A new owner had bought up about 80 acres of wooded, half-cleared farmland just outside of Haversville. It had an old graveyard on it, small, fenced in with leaning headstones and most of the names rubbed clean by time and rain. The new owner wanted to convert the place into some kind of event property, weddings, retreats, whatever rich people do when they get bored. My job was to help clear out some of the older growth, knock down an old barn, and stay on site for 6 weeks to keep watch over the equipment. The graveyard legally couldn't be touched, but everything around it was free game. I arrived on the first Monday in October. The cabin I was given was maybe 300 feet from the cemetery. I say cabin generously. It was a one-room box with a wood stove, a cot, a folding chair, and a little table with a lamp on it. The toilet was an outhouse about 50 yards downhill, which wasn't fun in the dark. There was a hand pump for water, but no electricity beyond what a small generator could offer for a few hours a day. But I was used to worse. I'd stayed in bug-infested trailers on job sites in Louisiana. I'd worked oil patches where you were lucky if you got a hot meal in the span of a week. This cabin was quiet, and quiet was what I wanted. The first few days went by smooth. I spent daylight hours helping the clearing crew, cutting saplings, dragging branches, pulling up fence posts. Around dusk, the others would load up in their trucks and head back to town. I'd sit by the cabin, eat canned stew or some of the jerky I brought, maybe drink a beer, and then turn in early. The woods got dark fast in that part of Kansas, especially with the thick trees closing in on every side. The graveyard didn't bother me at first. It was about the size of a backyard, 30, maybe 40 old graves. Some had small iron fences around them. Most had simple headstones or just flat stone slabs. I'd walk past it each morning heading to the work area. There wasn't much to look at. Dead grass, a couple leaning markers, a few gnarled trees standing watch over it like old guards. But after about a week, things started to feel off. It began with the scratching sounds. I'd hear them late, usually sometime around 1 or 2 in the morning. I'd wake up thinking it was just wind or some small animal nosing around the cabin walls. Then I started finding claw marks around the door. At first I thought raccoons, then maybe a stray dog. But the markings were deep and wide with rough edges, not the clean scratches of little paws. Something stronger. I started to keep the hatchet beside my cot. Not that it would help much, but it made me feel better. Then there was the smell. One night I woke up gagging. It hit me like someone had dumped a bucket of rotting meat just outside the window. I got up and stepped out into the cold. The air was heavy, dead still, and the smell was there, thick, clinging to my clothes, but I couldn't find the source. I walked around the cabin twice with a flashlight. Nothing.
No carcass. No trash.
Just that smell, thick as motor oil hanging low over the trees. It vanished by morning. I told myself it was just a dead animal in the woods.
Ides mallat bursa.
But deep down, I didn't buy it. By the 3rd week, I wasn't sleeping much. I was still working through the days, dragging logs and stacking brush. But at night, I stayed alert. I'd sit outside the cabin in the folding chair with the hatchet across my lap, watching the dark tree line. There were no sounds, no wind, no owls, no bugs. Just this deep, choking silence that seemed to crawl into your lungs. The graveyard started to get to me. I'd walk past it faster each morning. I tried not to look at it too long, but something always pulled my eyes toward it, like I was being watched. It was stupid. I knew it was stupid, but I couldn't shake the feeling. One morning, I noticed the dirt was disturbed around one of the older graves. Just a small shift in the earth, like something had sunken down slightly. I tried to tell myself it was normal. Rain, erosion, maybe an animal burrowing underneath. But that grave hadn't been touched in probably 100 years. Why would the ground suddenly shift now? I stopped walking past the graveyard. I started cutting through the trees instead, even though it took longer. Something about walking too close to those leaning stones made my skin crawl. On the 25th day, something changed. I was working alone near the back property line, clearing up some brush where the old barbed wire fence had fallen in. It was late, probably around 6. The sky had gone gray, and the trees swayed with the kind of wind that carries rain behind it. As I was pulling up a half-rotted fence post, I heard movement behind me. Not just twigs snapping or branches rustling, real movement. Wait, intent. I turned, expecting to see a deer maybe. Instead, I saw a man. He was standing about 50 feet away, just inside the tree line. He wasn't moving, just standing there, half hidden behind a trunk, staring. He wore a brown coat, maybe canvas or some old hunting jacket. I couldn't see his face clearly, just the pale shape of it through the trees. His posture was stiff. Still, I didn't say anything. I just watched him for a long minute, then backed away slowly. I left the post half buried and walked back to the cabin. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I shut my eyes, I pictured that man standing just outside the trees, waiting, watching. The next morning, I hiked back to the spot. Nothing was there.
No footprints.
No signs of anyone. The leaves looked undisturbed. Maybe I imagined it, or maybe not. I started carrying my hatchet with me everywhere. 3 days later, I found something on the cabin door. It was early, maybe just past 5. The sun hadn't fully come up yet, but there was enough light to make things out. On the center of the cabin door, carved deep into the wood, were the numbers, 1911. I stood there staring at it for a long time. I hadn't heard anything the night before.
No footsteps. No scratching.
Nothing. Whoever had done it had come right up to the door while I slept just feet away. I checked the graveyard later that morning. One of the headstones, almost completely worn smooth, had those same numbers chiseled faintly into the base. 1911. I must have walked past it a dozen times and never noticed. That night, I didn't go inside the cabin. I took my sleeping bag and moved out into the woods, maybe 200 yards away. I found a thicket and curled up behind it with the hatchet in hand. I figured it was safer to be out there than inside the cabin, where the door could be quietly opened or someone could creep up without me hearing. Out in the woods, at least I could see. I stayed awake the whole night. The woods were quiet again, but this time I could hear the silence. It pressed in on me, thick and heavy, like a blanket soaked in oil. By morning, I packed my things. I left a note for the foreman, shoved it under a rock near the tool shed. I told him I had to leave for personal reasons. I didn't give details. I didn't go back for the last paycheck. I never returned to Haversville, never asked what happened to the property or if the event center ever got built. I don't know if they tore down the cabin or cleared the graveyard woods. I don't care, but I still think about the man I saw. I still wonder what was in that grave marked 1911 and why it had shifted. I still wonder who carved those numbers into my door. I still remember the smell and the silence and the feeling that something or someone wanted me to stay there just a little longer. I live up north now, working in small towns. I don't take jobs near graveyards anymore. I don't sleep in cabins unless there's a lock on the door and neighbors within shouting distance. I keep my hatchet in the truck, and I always check the woods before sundown. Some places don't want to be cleared. Some land remembers, and some things buried should stay that way.